Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are, and welcome to the Courtauld and to the Centre for American Art. In a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Emily Burns, this evening's speaker, but before I do, just something really rapid about how the afternoon will unfold. So Emily's going to speak for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session, which I'm afraid we have to keep to 10 minutes, and apologies in advance to anybody whose question we don't get to. Please type your question when we get that far in the chat, and I will read them out to Emily, who will respond. Apologies in advance to anyone whose question I can't get to, as I said. I'm delighted now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Emily Burns, who is a specialist in the circulation of arts and objects in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her research asks how circulation is framed within the materiality of objects and how meanings changed through transit and through exhibition practices. She is an associate professor of art history at Auburn University and is the current Terra Foundation for American Art visiting professor at Oxford University, where she's completing a book to be called Performing Innocence, Cultural Belatedness and the US in fin-de-siècle Paris. She's author of Transnational Frontiers, the American West in France, co-editor of Mapping Impressionist Painting in Transnational Contexts, which has recently come out from Routledge, as well as articles on transnational exchange in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focused on Franco-US art exchange, on American Impressionism, and on Lakota arts. Her talk today is called The Vagabond as an Aesthetic Wanderer, Thomas Meteyard's Aesthetic Peregrinations, circa 1890. Welcome, Emily, and I'm going to turn over to you now.
Thank you so much, David, for the introduction and for the opportunity to share this work with you all today. Thank you all for being here. I also want to thank individuals and institutions who have facilitated my research on this artist and offered feedback on various iterations of this material, especially Katie Bourguignon, Jenny Meteyard, Nick Kilmer, David Deeringer, Robin Veeder, and also a grant from the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, which funded my access to related papers at the Dartmouth College Archives and at Houghton Library at Harvard. Picking up a copy of More Songs from Vagabondia, a perfectly hand-sized book of poems published in Boston by Copeland and Day in 1896, we note two authors, Bliss Carman and Richard Hovey, named on the cover, but three floating heads, bodiless in a roundel. The left head, the only one which faces and makes direct eye contact with the viewer as it cradles a crescent moon, depicts the project's illustrator and designer, Thomas Buford Meteyard, who produced woodblock prints for the frontispiece and end piece and this cover. The three truncated heads float against an amorphous black that renders them no place, or maybe an outer space, appropriately for their concept of poetry written and delivered from a nebulous, imaginary vagabondia in this second of a triad. Opening the book urges a waiting figure into motion. Straddling the gutter of the book's frontispiece, a man lays flat on his back, smoking a pipe, his legs resting on the edges of the boat. In the foreground on both sides of the image, tree branches from pollarded willows reach out like arms that release the boat to the river's current, and that even seem to push on the oars that are raised up out of the water. While these oars do seem above the water, they also seem to produce a wake, as figure and environment mutually transform each other. These undulating lines emphasize the water's pace. Meteyard's monogram of a turtle, and if you look here, you can see it, His monogram of a turtle visibly connects with those lines of current, an indication that his artist self too channels the river's motion. Perhaps asleep under a large hat or gazing up into the tree limbs above him, this figure gives himself over to the current. Hovey's poem floats as a thought bubble above this lazy figure, whose furthest footstep never strayed beyond the village of his birth, is but a lodger for the night in this old wayside inn of earth. Tomorrow he shall take his pack and set out for the ways beyond, on the old trail, from star to star, an alien and a vagabond. The poem juxtaposes sedentary and mobile with a nod to the fleetingness of life. It idealizes travel made light with only a pack, an adventurous spirit, and open-mindedness about destination. While dynamic, this boat's location is identifiable through the distinctive trees and the curling stream as the river Epte, which curves through Giverny, France. Upon looking at this woodcut, Carmen wrote proudly to the artist, "Did I tell you how fine I thought the canoeing vagrant?" Indeed, this figure operates as an icon of the intermediate art practice that Meteyard and his friends undertook. This talk argues that Meteyard co-opted the concept of the vagabond, a wandering traveler without a set destination, as a metaphor for his physical mobilities and for his oscillation between stylistic approaches. For Meteyard, vagabondage signified his individual experimentation, which both flexibly explored grounded impressionist plein-air painting, as well as more mood-driven symbolist experience. While Meteyard uses this language himself, as attested to the canoeing vagrant and comments throughout his letters, I also build out this concept as a framework for analysis by drawing on mobility studies and theoretical discourses around vagabond materiality. Using writings by cultural geographer Tim Cresswell, who has analyzed the vagabond and the migrant in circulation studies, the talk contextualizes Meteyard's self-conscious vagabondage as an example of how mobility studies might be brought to bear on reframing fin-de-siècle transnational and aesthetic circulations in ways that supersede long-standing hierarchies of national art histories, of medium and scale, as well as narratives of stylistic progress. Indeed, these aspects of his career, his fluid national identity, his eclectic styles, and the small scale in which he worked, alongside the rhetoric of the vagabond, gave his practice an anti-commercial tone, and these factors have really led art historians to marginalize his work. We will look today at Meteyard's biography and survey his artistic eclecticism, and then turn back to the concept of the vagabond as a tool for understanding his career, both in his own terms and as a scholarly lens, to see how the mobilities are rendered into the very fabric of his art. Meteyard's career has not been centered in art historical conversation, though he wanders occasionally through books on US artists in Giverny or articles about the artist colony in Scituate, Massachusetts. But he has been the subject of 3 monographic exhibitions since 1989, the first at Berry Hill Galleries in New York, for which Nicholas Kilmer, a dealer, painter, and descendant of painter Frederick Frieseke, charted his biography and production. In 2004, Kilmer teamed up with Bronwyn Griffith for an exhibition about Meteyard at the home of the Nabi at the Terra Foundation's Musée de l'Art Américain in Giverny. In 2017, David Dieringer curated a 2-room exhibition of Meteyard's work in the Boston Athenaeum. Even noting the paintings on the cover of these 3 catalogs suggest Meteyard's tremendous stylistic diversity, from impressionist facture and light in a nightscape of a bridge at Scituate, Massachusetts at left, which was shown at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904, to flatter, even, and high-keyed planes of color and Japanese compositions as at center, also made in Scituate, to bug's eye views painted en plein air in watercolor in Giverny, which you can see at right. Meteyard was born in Illinois in 1865 and died in Switzerland in 1928. His father died when Meteyard was 3, and the artist maintained a close relationship and cohabitation with his mother, Marion Greenwood Lunt Meteyard, until her death in 1915. They lived first in her hometown of Scituate, a coastal town of Boston. Meteyard studied briefly at Harvard, including art history courses with Charles Eliot Norton. And at Harvard, he became friends with poets Hovey and Carmen. Described by Dieringer as untiring travelers, Meteyard and his mother made several trips to Europe and the United Kingdom in the late 1880s that solidified his artistic explorations. Meteyard and his mother kept up avid correspondence with both poets, and when More Songs from Vagabondia was published, the men dedicated the volume to her. In late 1888, Meteyard moved to Paris and enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, working with academic artists Léon Bonnat and Alfred Philippe Rolle. Like many of his contemporaries, he explored the artist colonies outside of Paris, especially Giverny, where he spent time in summers between 1890 and 1892 with Carmen and Hovey. US painters had been frequenting Giverny since the late 1880s, although the initial colonists claimed to have no knowledge that Claude Monet lived in the village when they discovered it near a station selected at random. Meteyard resided, sorry, I've lost my mouse. Okay, there we go. Meteyard resided with his mother at the Hôtel Baudy, which provided housing and studio space. Like many of the resident artists, Meteyard exhibited paintings in the hotel lobby and in the dining room. And period postcards and photographs show the space filled with paintings. And in a photograph of Meteyard standing between Madame Baudy at left and his mother at right, you can see he's just beside James Carroll Beckwith's impressionist portrait of John Leslie Breck. This visual relationship speaks to Meteyard's participation in a space of artistic camaraderie and shared explorations of impressionism. Another Giverny regular, Dawson Watson, noted in his memoirs that he initially thought Meteyard was merely out rambling for hours around the Giverny landscape because there was, quote, no evidence of painting materials anywhere, when the artist would set off from Baudy in the morning. But after seeing a, quote, beautiful little gem of a watercolor at Baudy and then 40 more, Dawson Watson realized that the painter had been doing more than drifting. Quote, watercolor box, sketching pad, brushes, and water bottle all stuffed into his pockets. He certainly fooled us all. Gems is the right term for these little paintings, which are usually about 5 by 7 inches or 13 by 18 centimeters, and sometimes even smaller. Pairing delicate detail and open washes of vibrant color, the paintings chart the topography, light effects, and colors of the Norman landscape as though records of Meteyard's perceptive peregrinations. A view of the medieval church in Vernon, which you can see at upper left, is monochromatic with fine detail. And meanwhile, a watercolor at lower right of the Giverny grain stacks that Monet was concurrently painting in series renders a blurry array of swaths of vibrant color that capture the evanescent effects of dawn or dusk. In Giverny, Meteyard also made some small plein-air paintings in oil. In On the Banks of the Seine, for instance, he depicts the effects of reflections in the water's surface, using a parallel facture broken by horizontals in blue-white that imply the river's current. When such paintings were shown in New York, one reviewer celebrated that Meteyard, quote, shows what the Impressionists so often strive for and so rarely attain, the sensation of moving, quivering atmosphere, of color actually transformed or irradiated by sun or moon. Meteyard's Giverny paintings, though, sometimes stray from Impressionist conventions and more visibly dilute and refract his experiences of nature. Iris near Giverny at left encourages us to imagine the painter laying in a field of flowers, with his Japanist space with radical foreground and background distinction and its firm outlines. This composition and use of line, as well as the high-keyed colors, link more with the circle of the Nabi. In The Purple Trees, Meteyard retains Impressionist brushstrokes, but experiments with arbitrary color. The vibrant orange against the purple sky suggests a heightened sense of color, and the compositional space seems to teeter due to the abrupt cropping. Meteyard also probed night for its expressive possibilities in both oil and watercolor. At left, Giverny moonlight treats the structure of the building, the path, and the sky as abstract planes of modulated color. The distant hill and fence are articulated with partially mixed strokes of a range of color. These effects still time with a moody sense of mystery that pushes beyond a sense of optic vision. Meteyard extended this interest in nocturnes to the Paris nightscape, making a series of small woodblock prints depicting a rear view of Notre Dame, mostly in shades of blue. As Griffith and Kilmer both point out, these moodier nocturnal scenes verge on nascent symbolism. These paintings follow the expeditions of Meteyard's body and his imagination, but both not always moving in the same directions. His exhibition record in Paris parallels his multi-directional practice. He exhibited both in the large scale of the Salon of the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts in 1893, and also in smaller exhibitions, such as with the mostly French artists of the Nabi Circle at the second and third exhibitions of Peintres impressionistes et symbolistes, held in the gallery spaces of Louis-Léon Lebac de Bouteville in April and November of 1892. This record also highlights the eclectic looking he was doing. His letters suggest his visits not only to the Centennial Exhibition of French Art at the 1889 Expo Universelle, but also the group Impressionniste et Synthétiste at the Café Volpini. In 1890, he visited an unknown private collection of over 100 Impressionist paintings and wrote how his perception from the train on his return to Giverny inspired a new painting. Meteyard moved back to the United States in 1893 into the house and studio his family and friends called Testudo at Scituate, Massachusetts. And here you can see two photographs of the studio building alongside Meteyard's portrait of Carmen riding outdoors with the studio behind. In addition to working on the 3 volumes for Songs from Vagabondia with Carmen and Hovey, Meteyard continued to make the gem watercolors as he had in Giverny. But he also made a series of watercolors that transformed the coastal landscapes of Scituate into simplified pen and ink views with thick outline and solid, vibrant blocks of juxtaposed color. In Scituate Bay at right, the landscape is rendered with a flat and Japanist set of fields, color fields with no modulation of color within each unit. The asymmetrical coastline creates an ambling plane that draws the viewer into the composition. Some of his watercolors highlight a vibrant red-orange that locals say is akin to the sunset color on the dunes, such as Scituate green and red, the dunes, and the marshes. The artist here too flattens a sense of space and 3-dimensional recession by presenting the scenes as solid, thickly outlined blocks of color. And then Meteyard translated these watercolor compositions into woodblock prints that drew the scene and transformed it further by experimenting with different palettes. For instance, the composition of Scituate red and green, the dunes, became a nocturne in moonrise over the dune. Meteyard moved back to England in 1906, and he spent the remainder of his career based in England and Switzerland with many travels in France. And he continued in this multi-directional stylistic practice in larger scale in watercolors such as Hampstead Heath at Night, which continues the nocturne theme, and Pink Poppy's Summer Moses Hill Farm at the right, where Meteyard renders the gardens of the estate he purchased in 1916 with his wife Isabel near Fernhurst in West Sussex. Meteyard's paintings and prints were shown at many exhibitions at the Georges Petit Gallery in Paris, for instance, and also London galleries in the 1910s and 20s. And long obituaries in both French and English were published upon his death in 1928. But his collected works present challenges to the art historian because of his transnational identities and his eclecticism. The exhibition about Meteyard chez les Nabis emphasizes the painter's fluidity among symbolists and synthetists at the Bac de Bouteville exhibitions, whereas travels through impressionism aligns him with this movement. But his work is often both, or neither fully. Across the paintings, we can trace Meteyard experimenting with thick impasto or with insistently flat surfaces. Sometimes he builds steady perspectival recession, and other times jarring disjunctions between foreground and background. How do we account for this practice, which is peripatetic in place as well as in style? Mobility studies offers models for art historians to frame both the dynamism of artists and such aesthetic fluidity. Originating in the intensive globalization of the late 20th century, as Stephen Greenblatt has charted, the field offers, and I quote from him, brave new theories of hybridity, network theory, and the complex flows of people, goods, money, and information across endlessly shifting social landscapes. Linking with some of the queries of anthropologist James Clifford to explore the culture of routes more than routes, Greenblatt provocatively claimed, quote, reality is more about nomads than natives. Just as stasis and groundedness offer one way of viewing the world, mobilities offer other epistemologies that are no less deep. As Cresswell defines it, mobility is socially produced motion. What mobility studies can offer to Meteyard is a non-linear model for understanding his artistic experiments that operate more as multi-directional rhizomes than a singular progress or singular trajectory. Meteyard's language underscores how mobility is central to his art making and his self-definition. He presents himself regularly as a vagabond. In letters written during his travels, Meteyard emphasizes his wandering. One letter proposing possible destination notes, maybe Europe or the Azores or Washington. In his letters to Hovey in 1888, as he hiked around England's Lake District, Scotland and Ireland, he used to tramp or tramping as a verb. And in 1889, he tried to convince Hovey to come to France to, quote, take a long lazy tramp with me. His letters construct an identity as a solitary wanderer and even once an unfortunate exile, as he explored new landscapes without a circumscribed timeline. Carman and Hovey both played with similar language in their trilogy of poems from the songs from Vagabondia. In The Joys of the Road, Carman celebrates he who, quote, travels without a load. And in the title poem, Vagabondia, Hovey imagines unencumbered experience. Off with the fetters that chafe and restrain, off with the chain. To a vagabond's ardor, honest sincerity, we are in verity free. Hovey speaks to shared resistance to commercial society and to formula, and I'm quoting again from the same poem, free to be oddities, not mere commodities, stupid and saleable, we are not labeled, we are ourselves. This language participates in a wider cultural conversation about vagabondage in France and in the United States in this period. As Cresswell has charted, the concept has early modern origins. A 1531 act defined a vagabond as, quote, any man or woman being whole and mighty in body and able to labor, having no land or master, nor using any lawful merchandise, craft, or mystery whereby he might get his living. This definition frames a vagabond as someone able but refusing to participate in sedentary social systems or to contribute to the larger economy through labor. Having no land or master enabled one to define themselves by what Cresswell calls a constant but seemingly aimless motion, instead of trade or responsibility. Two defining factors here are an insistent mobility and poverty. As a modern figure, the vagabond or its cousins, the vagrant, the tramp, and the nomad, design for Cresswell, and here again I quote, a vivid geographical imagination, a set of knowledges and imaginings about mobility and what mobility might mean in the modern world. The vagabond presents us with an alternative spatiality. In the fin-de-siècle, Cresswell argues, the vagabond took on particular currency in the context of time-space compression, resulting from the technologies of mobility and transport, such as the railroad, and I would add too the steamship crossing the Atlantic, which reduced significantly in voyage time and cost in the decades following the Civil War. The unprecedented speed of motion propelled more individuals to circulate with greater fluidity. In France, as Timothy B. Smith and other historians have shown, public discourse pathologized the figure of the vagabond as a symbol of anarchist resistance to the modern state and its capitalist projects, and one who must be quelled. The French jurist Theodore Homburg, who published books about vagabondage from the 1860s to the early 1880s, anxiously described, outside of society that it frightens and repels, lives a class of individuals for whom there is no family, no regular work, and no fixed domicile. That is the class of the vagabonds. The medical diagnosis of a fugue in France, a label given to, quote, disturbed mental state that involves sudden uncontrollable urges to travel, reveals the attempts to tamp down on this practice. It doesn't exist anymore, by the way. As Kristen Ross has argued in her study of social space and the Paris Commune, vagabonds were defined through expectation of future crimes their worldviews would inevitably cause them to commit. In a story called The Vagabond, published in 1887, Guy de Maupassant traces this persona as a misfit for society and a public detriment in his protagonist, Randall, who sets out delighted to undertake migrancy, but ends up committing crimes and encouraging the police to lock him up because he longs for sedentary life again. Maupassant's story enacts the structure Ross sets out of a, quote, eventual violation of the laws. So therefore, vagabonds are always virtual, anticipatory. The art historian John Hutton has traced how anarchist artists in France, like Camille Pissarro and Maximilien Luce, took up the vagabond in the 1890s as an icon of social critique. Both underscore able-bodied men in transit, with their packs set aside and nursing their tired feet at river's edge. Yet, as Hutton argues, the message of such images was muddied by the difficulty of rendering poverty as a cultural ideal and the need for titles and caption language to explain the significance of this figure. Meanwhile, in the United States, as Cresswell has argued, in the decades before Meteyard's career abroad, the term tramp entered parlance to refer to individuals who were homeless and mobile. Cresswell suggests that the discourse of US self-discovery through exploration in the settler colonial state produced a more positive and romantic version of the vagabond than in France, at least for white men. This more amenable version seems to be the one cultivated by Meteyard, Hovey, and Carmen as a signal for ludic individuality and anti-commercialism more than a ferocious and adversarial anarchy. They used the vagabond as a mode of expression and artistic positioning more than as political intervention. The vagabond is layered and contradictory, as Cresswell sums, quote, a figure of inspiration, a role model, an outlaw who asks important questions of established truths, both a nightmare figure of chaos and simultaneously a romantic figure of freedom and critique. Meteyard and his contemporaries repress the total stubborn refusal of social norms or anarchism, but embrace the language of emancipation and an ambivalence about the social order. Meteyard's travel is enabled by access to at least enough resources to move abroad and have some fluidity, and his language of exile and tramping conveniently overlooks the collective and shared nature of many of his explorations. So his posture as vagabond is simulated and selective, dropping two of the characteristics, the abject poverty and the solitude, while retaining the notion of aimless wandering as heightened experience and a strategy to decommodify art making. Meteyard's adoption of the vagabond propels three aspects of his art practice: its interest in naivete, its strident individuality, and its insistent eclecticism. As scholars, including Richard Schiff, Joel Isaacson, and others have shown, modernism centered around a cult of the new that claimed to reject tradition by rendering instead immediate experience. And naivete is an important strategy for this that Meteyard embraces through the figure of the vagabond. His canoeing vagrant and his vagabond status, both as traveler and artist, enable him to imply that his practice is untrained, and he argues as though through his image to the viewers that he has lifted his oars and deferred any control of his style to the river's current. Wandering boats from Charles d'Aubigny's studio boat to Monet's and to Beckwith's alike, became a leitmotif of this uncontrolled practice of letting nature's course shape the artist. Reviews of songs from Vagabondia in the US press underscored a paradoxical, quote, sophisticated simplicity and primitive guise of ignorance that were created by the poems and images. The US colony in Giverny also framed possibilities of naivete in its creation of a little magazine called Courrier Innocent, or Innocent Mail, which itself implies a kind of mobile naivete. This collaborative project was printed with a mimeograph in the years that Meteyard was in Giverny. And it featured images like the one on the right that imagines an artist being shooed out of the atelier into the countryside. And it's a bit hard to see, but I'll move my cursor to this kind of winged skull that is behind the artist, kind of pushing him out into nature. In Situate a few years later, Carmen, Hovey, and Meteyard reinvigorated this little magazine using woodblock printing under the name Saltmarsh Press. These multimedia representations underscore naivete as visual strategy for escaping conventionality and valorizing transit in ways that paralleled the trope of the vagabond. Vagabondage also registers Meteyard's claims to artistic individuality. As Schiff argues in the end of Impressionism, subjectivity and originality undergirded both impressionist and symbolist aesthetics. It's just a question of whether one was looking for that subjectivity inwardly or outwardly. And two of Meteyard's self-portraits trace this dual exploration of the artist's self in place and concept. The left, an impressionist self-portrait, which seems to have been painted en plein air in Arcachon in 1892. And then on the right, a distilled watercolor, focusing on just the artist in an unclear setting. And both of these images, I think, significantly link with the figure of the vagabond in more songs from Vagabondia, from the pipe used by the plein-air painter and the canoeing vagrant, to the image that appears in the roundel on the cover of that volume. This slippage of self into image transforms the artist multiply into the position of the vagabond. Throughout his time in France, Meteyard wrote about avoiding becoming contaminated by study. He wrote to Hovey in April 1890, "This feeling has been growing of late. I feel a disgust for the schools and that I must be getting away by myself, face nature, and work the great problems out in what way I can. At any rate, it is better to fail altogether than to be like the crowd that see and paint through another man's eyes. I have no desire to paint like any of the men I have studied with. Of course, there are some who I admire immensely, Puvis de Chavannes, Cazin, Monet, and Bénard, for instance. But they are the great individual men who work in ways quite peculiar to themselves." As Meteyard presses here, individuality is the watchword. Meteyard's oscillation and exploratory wandering between Impressionism and symbolism, what he described as a dab about, resist uniformity and insist on individualized experimentation. Stuart Merrill, a US poet also working in France in this period and moving in the same symbolist circles, wrote a poem in which he described the narrator trying to trace the footsteps of another vagabond, but the pursued disappears. Merrill implies that one's wandering will by definition take an individual path. True individual courses cannot be followed. Meteyard engages with the stylistic languages of Impressionism, symbolism, and even Art Nouveau, but he is typified by none of them. And significantly, one critic noted that Meteyard's styles are always, quote, adapted to the subject. Looking at the aesthetics of his paintings and his prints is less a formalist exercise and more about trying to read the coded message that emerge from this unfixity. Collectively, Meteyard's work resists categorization, like, as Cresswell puts it, the vagabond thumbing his nose at all kinds of ordering. Indeed, the vagabond is difficult to pin down by definition. Quoting Cresswell again, the vagrant appears and disappears in a kind of perpetual dissatisfaction with the status quo. Meteyard and his art come in and out of view through his peripatetic practice, episodic like the vagabond, evading definition and defying the very labels designed to describe them. Meteyard himself seems to have resisted stylistic categories. One critic in 1894 commented that when he declared Meteyard an impressionist, the artist retorted, "What is impressionism in art?" The reviewer complained that it was, quote, as if the term conveyed no significance to Meteyard's intelligence. The writer shrugged off the statement as mere evidence of the artist's eccentricity and concluded instead that Meteyard, quote, possessed a pronounced individuality of style. This conclusion aligns with Meteyard's goals. His stylistic versatility deflects being fixed by any moniker. This notion of individuality appears frequently in the criticism of Meteyard's work. One insisted Meteyard, quote, has studied his art but little in the schools, following Monet's doctrine that a painter should develop his own individuality. Likewise, an interocean critic in 1894 concluded, quote, this young American artist has profited by the best foreign schools, yet preserved a tone of originality that separates his work from the conventional stamp of any school. Meteyard's artistic vagabondage led critics to declare his individuality, even as the comments subtly suggest the paradoxes of following others' quests for individualism. And indeed, by this period, one could argue that Impressionism becomes an anti-formula formula. In line with fierce individuality, the Vagabond centers eclecticism. Working against a sedentarist metaphysics, as Cresswell argues, the Vagabond, and here I quote from him again, the Vagabond's wayward travels meant that he always had traces of elsewhere that disturbed those who had chosen a settled and rooted existence. Meteyard's work exhibits these directional nods, this kind of layering of different places and approaches. His practice does reveal occasional aesthetic concurrences too, such as his shared probing of night and mystery, concurrent with Norwegian Edvard Munch, who was at Bonnat's atelier at the same time in 1889, or his experiments with woodblock printing in Situate that share visual language with Arthur Wesley Dow's evocative small woodblock prints of moonlight from the 1890s. But then Meteyard parts ways again. To Hovey, he considered his engagement with many styles, quote, I am torn with impulses to do a dozen incompatible things. I have decided to quit the school tomorrow. Art above all is good, but where or which or what in art? Am I to be forever plagued with looking for what I don't know what? For Meteyard, the Vagabond allegorized this kind of language of searching and selecting. His wandering serves as a metaphor for his stylistic fluidity and non-fixity. In addition to historicizing Meteyard's Vagabond, we can also theorize the concept through the writings of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. In A Thousand Plateaus, the idea of the nomad is a leitmotif of unfixity and identities ever in formation, striated like heterogeneous layers of sedimentary rock. As the unfixity in Ross's framing of vagabonds as virtual and anticipatory, Deleuze and Guattari describe a, quote, vagabond materiality, which Cresswell summarizes as a, quote, materiality that doesn't have a pure form and is not finished and achieved. It is a materiality of becoming. As a philosophical prop building on Edmund Husserl's phenomenological explorations of, quote, vague and material essences, the Vagabond implies mobility, unfixity, and valorizes the vague. Deleuze and Guattari also describe a, quote, ambulant coupling of event and affect. As Cresswell puts it, the alternate spatiality of the Vagabond offers, quote, a sense of not being quite there yet. The Vagabond brings a fuzziness to the world some would like to hold as fixed and certain and sedentary. In this context, we might think about Meteyard's art as offering perhaps a purposeful fungibility and rendering itself perpetually in the state of becoming and in this kind of unresolved search that forms the basis of his career. One of Meteyard's large watercolors depicts the wake of an ocean liner trailing in the distance. Parts of the painting register textured surface and layers of watercolor to depict rippling waves, whereas the waves closest to the boat are articulated through single strokes of color, and much of the paper left visible as though to form the effects of white foam. Meteyard signs in this part of the painting, where the strokes and the non-strokes become suggestive of an art project in formation. Similarly, Meteyard may have capitalized on woodblock printing as enabling a kind of visual instability by producing many different states of the same image. Of his prints of Notre Dame, he explores different shades of blues, sometimes dense and sometimes thin. These are actually from the same print, but taken with two different devices, so the color is a bit off. But you can see his attempts to create a gauzy Whistlerian effect over building and river. But in other examples, he more visibly blends painting and printmaking. And here you can see thick gestural strokes of the paint medium on the block surface that are traced onto the print. He also, across this series, used different weaves of paper, from thick woven to thin tissue. These alterations explore a multiplicity of expressions and the instabilities of fixing an image in ways that mark a kind of vagabond materiality, an interweaving of event and affect. While emergent in contemporary philosophy, as I've just framed it, it's important to note that this concept also resonates with ideas of William James and Henri Bergson from the 1890s, who were both exploring how fugitive perceptions are apprehended and the constant shifting of the relationship between the self and the world in ways that keep resurfacing in Meteyard's art. So in conclusion, Meteyard's life and art conveys the challenges and possibilities of analyzing mobile histories. We could never encapsulate or typify his career through one work of art, and I think this is by design. His Vagabondage leaves 3 boxes central to canonicity unchecked, and I think this has resulted in his being overlooked by art historians. First, there is the question of national identity. Still often dependent on national schools, a strongly territorialized art history is unaccountable to figures like Meteyard, who fluidly traverse national borders. In analyzing the 1890s, Americanists tend to prefer the artists who spent only brief stays in Paris in the 1860s, like Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins, whose careers can be navigated through tropes of US landscape and pragmatic realism. Meanwhile, as with many US artists working abroad, especially for extended periods, Meteyard's transnationalism and mobility ensures his marginalization. Art history needs to draw on the tools of mobility studies and from anthropology in order to more fully apprehend and address the complexities of a case like this. Second, Meteyard's career does not exemplify a formalist framing of stylistic progress. Unbounded, his aesthetic vagabondage confuses art historical periodization because it produces objects which are perpetually interstitial and which cannot be framed into a simple narrative of stylistic progress or phases. Third, his preference for watercolor and small-scale transportable materials render him overlooked by a privilege for larger-scale production and oil painting. Thus, Meteyard's very vagabondage in life and in art was fundamental to his art practice, but also explains why his work is so often overlooked. By playing marginal, he unwittingly marginalized his legacy. But his vagabond materiality renders his career and his artwork, to our eyes, ever in a state of becoming. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes, as I say, for questions and answers. I would just say, if you would like to put your questions into the chat, then I can select and read them out. So there's, as usual, there's a bunch. Maybe while we're just waiting for people to gear themselves up, I could just ask you something about transnationalism, really, I suppose, Emily, which it's a very rich paper, and there were several aspects of it that I can see that you didn't have, complete. You didn't really have the opportunity to fully investigate. So I'm interested in the fact that he leaves the US and goes to England, spends a long time there, and then I guess in the end goes to Switzerland. But in the UK there is a whole figure around this time, and particularly in the early 20th century. So the two things that just occur to me are Robert Louis Stevenson, who's writing about, he wrote a series of poems. I think it's a collection, the Vagabond poem, right? And actually, these are rather brutal poems in some ways. They're not, I mean, they are celebratory, but they don't pull the punches, really. And also Douglas Goldring, who, who's involved with Ford Madox Ford and people, and in 1910 becomes the editor of I think an existing magazine called the Tramp and Open Air magazine. And those are, so I just wonder actually whether what you'd say about Meteyard's relationship to an existing idea of vagabondage in one of his adopted cultures.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a rich comment. And I was realizing as I was working that I need to do more digging into the Anglo concepts of the tramp and vagabond, because I really have focused on France and on the US. And in part, that's through the kind of scholarship of Cresswell, which tends to focus on those two cultures in particular. So I think I need to dig deeper, but I am interested in the kinds of ways in which these concepts are probably stylistically, distinct for these individual cultures. And I think that I need to spend more time kind of parsing how he's kind of wandering through these different concepts, as well as through the places. So thank you for those poets that you mentioned, and I look forward to reading into them more.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, as you say, I mean, the concept itself is very fluid. I mean, is the tramp the same as the vagabond? And how do these things act? But so one of the interesting questions is therefore how they relate to individual cultures specific, right? What is it about US or about UK culture that somehow brings out particular aspects to that? Anna Dempsey asks an interesting question: any women vagabond artists?
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for this question. In the time period that I'm working on, I don't see women artists adopting that same kind of language or discourse, even if they're kind of doing it in practice. Like just thinking about someone like Fidelia Bridges, a mid-19th century painter who was just interested in like painting flowers and kind of hiking and painting as she was hiking. And she took herself to Italy, I think on her own, and did some paintings there too. But I don't see her kind of taking up that language. But that said, there is a chapter in Tim Cresswell's book, which is called The Vagrant in America, where he focuses on women vagabonds, but mostly in the 20th century. So kind of later moment where there is a more kind of greater gender flexibility in this motif.
This is an interesting question, I think, by somebody, I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's just a moniker or a handle, whatever. Would it be fair to call the vagabond a rural equivalent to the urban flaneur?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, I think so. Although I guess, again, it might depend on the kind of context around the term, because in France, the figure of the vagabond is threatening. It's someone who's kind of like impoverished and isn't necessarily engaging in regular sanitation, and so it's the kind of person, if you encountered, you would kind of cross the street to be away from. And so I think, at least in France, there wouldn't be, because the urban plein-air is more typically kind of more elite individual, I think, who's kind of having this authority of gaze. So I don't necessarily see that overlaying, but I do wonder if in the ways in which the vagabond is both a kind of part of the world as they're traversing through it, but because they're mobile and not sedentary, their engagement with the world around them is somehow kind of more privileged, or that they have an eye that is greater, is more attuned to some of those kind of visual subtleties that would also register with a broader cosmopolitan ethos, that perhaps that kind of visual acuity and visual skepticism might be shared across those two figures. That's a great question.
Thank you. I think that links, and your reply links a bit to a question from James Hall. Is there any difference between vagabondage and tourism? Does Meteyard go to places that are not tourist destinations, or by implication that are, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I think that for Meteyard, the distinction for the vagabondages are kind of, it's twofold. It's that he's not necessarily planning the destinations in advance, but kind of leaving the choices more up to whim. And he's also, you can tell in his letters to Hovey that he's not entirely sure where he's going to be when. So he'll say like, okay, I'm going to be here for maybe, I don't know, 3 days, 5 days. So this kind of like lack of planning, I think differentiates it from a kind of tourist enterprise. But certainly Meteyard's destinations draw on beaten track between the kind of east coast of the US to France and around parts of England's Lake District and Ireland and Scotland that are already kind of established tourist routes. But I think too, he's also camping a lot of the way through his trips. And so that's another kind of layer of his travel that differentiates it slightly from kind of tourism. But in terms of his destinations themselves, I don't think he's going anywhere that tourists also wouldn't go.
And why does he go to Switzerland? That's also a question that's come up in the chat. I'm sorry, I can't.
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer off the top of my head, even though I should. I'd have to look back at the kind of biographical literature. I've focused so much on the kind of 1890s and very early 20th century as this kind of key moment in his career. But if you send me an email, I will send you the answer. I'm very findable online.
I should also say that the chat will be available to Emily afterwards, so that she'll see the questions that we don't get to. James Hall also asks about American Indians in relation to vagabondage, and whether Meteyard or anybody else actually talks about American Indians in relation to that. But I think there's a version of that question, or related to that question, from Carolyn Arscott as well, who writes, how does the transnational identity link to the colonial figure with, for example, English Indian or South African postings, or to the idea of the global citizen, the cosmopolitan, as Andrew Stevenson might discuss it? Or possibly Andrew Stevens, sorry.
Okay. Great, thank you, Caroline, as well, for that rich question. So I think with regard to Native Americans, I don't think that Meteyard ever mentions them, nor in the Vagabondia volumes, but I would have to go back to be sure. But you know, I was just reading Sherry Hundorf's wonderful book, Going Native Again, yesterday for class today, and she is really persuasive about thinking through how a kind of different sort of anti-modernist engagement with the landscape that emerges in the 1890s in the context of a kind of absorption of Native American culture into US fabric kind of militarily, enabled Americans to kind of seek out a connection with Native Americans as a kind of originary narrative of US identity. And this is the same kind of movement of like the Boy Scouts and summer camps and kind of being out in nature and this kind of experience of privation that frames the idea of going native. And so while I don't think that there's a literal quoting of American Indians in Meteyard's material, I think there is a kind of shared ethos of in a kind of anti-modernist way in the 1890s of building these relationships and connections with nature through these like alternate experiences that's kind of the same ilk. And to Caroline's question, I don't think I know Andrew Stevens' work about cosmopolitanism, but I'm very excited to look into that. And I wouldn't be surprised to find kind of similar relationships in other settler colonial contexts or imperial contexts, because there is a kind of privilege that emerges through the travel and opportunity and kind of like the freedom to travel unquestioned in these spaces that I think is part of a larger global power imbalance.
It's Andrew Stevenson, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and you know, to just gesture to another question that's in there, you know, it's specifically a historicization of the idea of the cosmopolitan.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah. So Anna Dempsey has responded. She asked an earlier question and responds to what you said. And I think what this means, you spoke about women and the language of vagabondage, you know, the adoption of a particular sort of term or language in defining their own, you know, ways of being in the world, I suppose. And in response, Anna is saying, you know, is it actually necessary to, you know, is there something about this language that they would not wish to have adopted, in a sense, right? Perhaps women or other marginalized groups may have used different language or even none. And, you know, is it a question of actually the practice without the adoption of the word?
Yeah, that's such a rich question. Again, thank you, Anna. And I need to keep thinking about this for sure. I'm just thinking about the kind of breadth of US artists who are women who are also traveling in Paris in the same time period and who write as prolifically as Meteyard does in letters and in journals. And indeed, I think if I saw the kind of aesthetic experimentation and exploration in their art practice or in their kind of destinations, I would be inclined to pursue the concept with them as well. But as I say that too, there isn't any artist who's like explicitly ringing out in my mind. So it's something I will keep thinking about.
Thanks. There's a question I haven't fully absorbed, excuse me, which is about the picaresque novel. Well, that's an interesting reflection. So Lisha Camille, thank you, is asking about whether the connections of the idea of the vagabond to the literature of the picaresque, the novel of the picaresque, that is a novel in which the hero is peripatetic by definition and is often of lower socioeconomic class, and it's about, you know, that person interacts without fully belonging to many levels of society, and you know, it's a continuing theme in European literature right into the 19th century, I think. I mean, Stevenson, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a short story about Francois Villon, for example, right? In which, you know, Villon and the idea of the vagabond, which defines how people looked at Villon in those times, you know, seems very powerfully to be operating. So do you see that connection? I mean, do you think that picaresqueness is in play here?
Yes, thank you so much for this comment and question. And I do think so. And those novels kind of emerge at the same time as the kind of codification of vagabondage in the 16th century. And Cresswell has also done some work on the picaresque as the kind of predecessor of the modern vagabond. And I do think that there are certain aspects of this kind of persona in the sense of a kind of trickster figure who deflects being defined in societal constructs or in particular ways. And there is also a kind of lighthearted and like playful humor in some of that material that I think emerges in this late 19th century context as well. But it's not necessarily a source that the artists are directly referencing or drawing on in explicit ways, even though it's certainly embedded in their frames of the vagabond.
Thanks. Maybe just a couple more, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
So Ted Jr. Esteval asks about the figure of the vagabond. Is it tied to notions of sexual transgression?
It depends on where. In the reading that I've done in France, absolutely. So in the Maupassant story that I mentioned, the vagabond character Randall gets like drunk and sexually assaults women, and that's how he ends up in jail. So his like crime is a sexual crime, and that kind of like pathologization of the figure of the vagabond appears a lot in the kind of French discourse. But in the US literature, at least of this period, that kind of connection doesn't appear. But certainly in the kind of later 20th or mid 20th century with like beat poetry, that connection does emerge there. So I think that's one of the kind of specific, like cultural specificities of this concept that I'm trying to disentangle.
Thank you. Maybe we should, I can just close by reading a rather nice contribution. It's not really a question, by Jenny Meteyard, who says Meteyard went to Switzerland partly so her father, his son Robert, could attend the Alpine College in Glion, and Switzerland was also thought to be good for their health.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that detail.
Great. I think that's a nice moment to come to an end. We've done more than our 10 minutes of question and answer, so thanks for that, Emily.
Thank you all for your questions and comments, and please do email me if we didn't get to anything.
As I said, Emily will see a copy of the chat, so she'll have your comments, and if you didn't get to ask your question, then she'll still see it. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody. Emily, thank you for a really rich and fascinating insight into Meteyard.
Thank you
very much.